Hi, this is Bob Murphy, and you're listening to the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to the show that gets Christians thinking about faith and politics. Get ready to challenge the status quo, expand your imagination, and tackle controversy head on. Let's stand together at the intersection of faith and freedom. It's time for the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome, everybody, to the Libertarian Christian Podcast. I'm Nick Gosling, Executive Director of the Libertarian Christian Institute, here with board member Doug Stewart and our second guest here on the Libertarian Christian Podcast, Robin Koerner. Robin gained fame in the liberty movement around the 2012 cycle when he wrote a very famous article on Huffington Post about the Blue Republican. And since then, he has continued to serve in the liberty movement and is now out helping organizations and other libertarians figure out how to better market the message for liberty. This is something that we as libertarians often need, but don't know how to do. Thankfully, Robin is an expert in this area, and he will give us some handy tips about how to be better representatives for the liberty movement. But first, we'll find out a little bit about his background. So, Robin, thanks for being with us. Can you tell us kind of where you came from leading up to that 2011-2012 cycle, your political background, and how the Blue Republican movement sort of came to be?
Yeah, hey, and thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. This is an important issue, and I'm always glad to talk about it. Yeah, okay, so where did it start for me? Well, I had no interest in politics really at all before about 2010. But I did back in 2004-05 start up a website called watchingamerica.com that translates foreign opinion about the United States from all over the world. And I'd been doing that for quite a while. And it was kind of as a result of that I kind of got interested in the American identity a bit. And I was thinking maybe I'd write a book that was inspired by that, but still with no particular interest in American politics per se. But in the course of researching, I guess, for that book, I came across a video by Peter Schiff, one of those Peter Schiff was right videos. And I'm a trained scientist, and this video of Peter Schiff predicting the housing crisis, saying why it was going to happen, how it was going to happen, and also being kind of almost laughed off the news network that he was on making these predictions. As a scientist, I was really interested in this because I had never heard economics or politics really approached in a scientific way, by which I mean you make testable predictions, specific predictions based on kind of general principles, and that those predictions are tested and then, they support a theory if they're proven to be correct. And here was this guy called Peter Schiff, who I'd never heard of, who was doing just that in the realm of economics. So as a trained physicist, that kind of interested me. In this video, he mentioned something called Austrian economics, so I Googled that. I read the wiki page. It linked to something called libertarianism, so I checked that wiki page, and I thought, well, this makes a lot of sense. So then I sent an email to a friend of mine who ran who still runs a libertarian nonprofit, and he talked about it sometimes, and I'd shown no interest. But now, as a result of Peter Schiff, Austrian economics, and the libertarian wiki page, I was interested, and I said, send me a reading list, please, Glenn. And so he did. And, a little bit of the canon later, so a bit of Hayek and a bit of Bastiat later, I thought this is something that resonates with me. And I developed an interest in politics and in liberty, and also being a Brit who was fervently working to become an American. I have a personal history that kind of, in a way, follows the history of the Anglo narrative of liberty. And so I got interested in my own history. Here I was in America, and I got interested in that part of British history, out of which really the Constitution came and my new adoptive country came, all those years ago. So I just kind of got excited about all this stuff around 2010. And also around that time, I was given an opportunity to write on the Huffington Post, actually as a result of my being the publisher of watchingamerica.com. And so by the time we got to 2011, I thought, well, you know what, I've got this platform. It's a platform that's a respected brand, respected, among the left. And before I had any interest in politics, I was basically a liberal by default, meaning I was a nice guy. I had good intentions. And so I figured, like I think a lot of liberals who, maybe haven't read some of the stuff that you and I might have read, you think that the better policies and the better politics are those that most directly manifest or instantiate your good intentions, which is a perfectly reasonable common sense point of view. It happens mostly to be wrong, but it's a decent point of view. And so remembering what it was like to be that liberal and having this platform to speak to liberals, I thought I will use that platform to see if I can make the case for Ron Paul, who I was supporting in the 2011-2012 cycle, to, my progressive friends. And I have been trained in sales. I studied epistemology to a high level, which is really the philosophy of belief and knowledge. And so I kind of just put all this together. And I've had a classical education, so I can write reasonably well. And I just put all this together and just thought I would take a punt. I didn't expect that anybody would pay any notice to anything I wrote, but it turns out they did. And that Blue Republican article, which was, as I say, advocacy for Ron Paul to the left, was called "If You Love Peace, Become a Blue Republican Just for a Year." And it was targeted at Obama voters, and it went viral within hours of hitting the Huffington Post. And within 1 or 2 weeks, I had Doug Weed on the phone, the senior advisor to the Ron Paul campaign, who had identified, the campaign had identified that Blue Republican, and I coined this term to refer to those who switched from the left, Democrat, Obama, over to the GOP specifically for Ron Paul in that cycle. They confirmed to me, the campaign confirmed to me, that that was the biggest identified coalition for Ron Paul. And it remained so from that week all the way up to the convention. So then I realized, I've got a skill, and B, this skill is needed, because there is no way some wet behind the ears Brit who basically just discovered liberty should be able to write the article that creates the biggest coalition for, a libertarian candidate in what is supposed to be one of the most libertarian countries in the world. How is it that the libertarian movement managed to fail to fill the gap that article filled? So I thought, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do with my life. I can help fight for liberty by making others better at communicating it. And as you said at the intro, for which thanks, that's what I now do.
Right. I remember actually in the last cycle, I don't remember exactly what it was. Like I keep saying 2011, 2012, but somewhere around there when you first sort of came onto the scene here, I saw your article. I mean, most of us did. In fact, Doug, you had just mentioned earlier that you had several friends who are on the left who voted for Ron Paul because they saw Robin's article. So it was definitely a kind of a watershed moment for the liberty movement in bringing people on the left over at least somewhat into a libertarian-esque camp, primarily around the issue of war. And, Murray Rothbard said that war is the most important libertarian issue because, and to quote another individual, Randolph Bourne, most of our listeners have heard the Randolph Bourne quote, "War is the health of the state." Wherever there's war, wherever there's an enemy to be fighting, there's going to be government expansion. That means less civil liberties, less economic freedom, a larger police state. All of these things kind of roll in with war. So by building that coalition around the leftists who at least were consistently pro-peace, which many on the left are not consistently pro-peace, but many of them are. And those who are, you were able to use that affinity in order to bring them over to vote for Ron Paul, which is really, really fascinating.
I remember as a already Ron Paul supporter at that time. In fact, I even bought a Ron Paul yard sign, T-shirt, and so forth. I was really excited about Ron Paul, and then I heard that friends that I kind of saw on the left were into this Blue Republican movement, and I thought, wow, that's really exciting. Does the time you spend arguing for liberty, do you tend to spend more time with those who are on the left, who are more like where you came from, or do you find yourself sort of, kind of stuck in the middle, in kind of an even split?
It's hard to say because I actually spend quite a lot of time speaking to folks who you'd identify more on the right. So maybe conservative, conservatarian, conservative libertarian, because they are the people that more often come to me to kind of get taught how to speak to their friends on the left. So a lot of what I'm doing is actually, on the one hand, I do spend time formulating the ideas of liberty in the language of the left, and we can talk about, that in this show. But also, I often get folks more on the right to kind of examine themselves, to be a little more humble about the way in which they maintain their libertarianism or their political views more generally. Because if I can open the mind of folks on the right a little, then I think it helps them accept what I'm teaching them about persuading the folks on the left. So really, it's kind of both. Whereas I'm selling liberty more directly to folks on the left, I'm selling the selling of liberty, if that makes sense, more to folks who tend to be more conservative. I think that's fair.
I think that's a good approach because, there's a lot of tension between the left and the right, and they sometimes kind of get stuck in their own kind of groove of arguing. And those on the right tend to have a hard time identifying with the values and passions of those who are on the left. And if you can't even identify with those on the other side, you really can't you can make your argument, but it's really only to hone your argument. It's not really to win anybody over.
That's right. And in my branding, if you go to robinkoerner.com, you see I've got a tagline, winning supporters, not arguments. And people are so invested in winning arguments. They set up an opposition where they only get to be right if the other person's, kind of admits to being wrong. It's kind of a zero-sum game. And not only you're never going to win that, but it just ignores so much of human nature, and so much. Especially recently, there's been so much study on kind of psychology and moral psychology in particular, that really we should all be grown up enough now to know that you have a choice. You can either actually be invested in winning the supporter and therefore extending the reach of liberty, or you can have an ego trip and come away from the argument knowing that you won it, but making actually no difference for liberty in our country. And a lot of that, as I say, is getting people out of their own way. Persuasion really starts with oneself. It's kind of, it can be an introspective process at the beginning. And you mentioned the word identify with, I think you said, or something like that. And that speaks to part of this, which is all politics really are the politics of identity. And I don't mean by that, are you a woman or are you black or are you white? I don't mean that kind of politics of identity. I mean the idea of, can I identify with the person who's telling me this thing? Because 80% of persuasion, at least, is having the person you're talking to identify with you, meaning I basically trust where this person's coming from, their worldview, their intention. So instead of my subconscious mind being primed to find reasons not to believe what he's telling me or agree with him, my subconscious mind actually wants to find reasons to agree. All reasoning is motivated, pretty much. So you've got to get the motivation of the reasoning of the person that you're trying to persuade going in your direction. And that's a lot more about empathy. It's a lot more about relationship and a lot less about actually having a debate, which is a completely different process.
So, Robin, one of the questions I have, when I think back on my own journey towards libertarianism, I came from a very strongly neoconservative bent many, many years ago. And sort of what started to move me away from that was with tactics that I guess you would say were rather aggressive, kind of in-your-face approaches. In the articles I was reading and the thinkers I was reading, they weren't necessarily nice about it. And at first that made me very angry. I thought, oh, this is horrible. These people hate America, or whatever. Ultimately, I came around. So I know there's other people who have kind of come from that same way, but generally that it tends to not be the case. It tends to be people who are much more patient with their listener and who can really build that affinity, like you were saying, who can win them over. So I guess my question is, right now, one of the big stories that we're seeing, just repeatedly, multiple examples of this on college campuses and in other contexts, are protesters who are just shouting down speakers. They don't want to have civil debate. They don't want to have dialogue. They're just sort of shutting down anything that they disagree with. So when you're dealing with those kind of people, and I think unfortunately that mindset is spreading, especially amongst people under, let's say, 35 or under 40. How do you reach that? I mean, or is it just an example? I mean, can it just be that some people aren't able to hear your message and you need to go to the people who are, or is there a way to get through to these individuals?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you kind of got to the answer there at the end of it. Yes, that some people are not worth expending your time and energy. And you never need more, really, than 10% of a society to get to critical mass, as long as it's actually pulling in the same direction, right? So I would not... You can't force somebody to sit down and listen to you, right? If for long enough that it's going to take to change a deliberately and consciously and specifically held paradigm that is absolutely rotten and wrong to the core, over to change it by 180 degrees. Don't start there. Don't start with the social justice warriors that think that, let's say, physical violence is an acceptable response to conservative opinion because conservative opinion is itself a form of violence. Just for example, don't start there. What I would do there is, and I have started talking more and more about this on my show, actually, because it really is an issue of our time. It's part of the political zeitgeist. Is you got to have a bit of faith here. Most people do not hold, let's say most liberals, most progressives are not, they're not they haven't gone away and read Marx and have made a specific cognitive wholesale commitment to a paradigm. Most of us hold our political views kind of by default, much more loosely, much more because we actually haven't heard a lot of competing views, right? In other words, there's plenty of folks on the soft left who we can meet in the normal ways of finding common ground, which I discuss at length in my seminars, for example, that you can make them feel more like you and much less like those people, let's say on the hard left, these social justice warriors that are doing this on the campuses right now, right? So, be aware that it's actually not too difficult, I think, if you get the common ground with the soft left, to show them that the hard left is much more like, let's say, much more like the fascists that they're supposedly railing against than they are like those folks on the soft left. And if that's hard to believe, read George Orwell. It's really fascinating that since Trump came in, 1984 has been flying off the shelves, right? And the people who've been buying it have been a lot of these folks on the left who think that Trump is, the rise of fascism in the US. Now, we can debate that. But George Orwell, in 1940, wrote an essay called something like My Country, Left or Right, or something like that. And he actually called out the anti-patriots and the communists who he had thought were his allies as being so caught up in their own righteousness. He actually uses the word enlightenment, that they can't appreciate good human sentiment, including in that essay, he was talking about patriotism. And so he actually identified, he said, as an international socialist, I identify with the humanity of the moderates and not anymore with the hard politics. He didn't use the word, but basically the authoritarianism of the hard left. And actually, it was that sensibility out of which the book 1984 came. Right? I mean, some animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. I mean, that's clearly a statement at the expense of the authoritarian left. That's a statement made by George Orwell, a self-identified international socialist. So, if even Orwell could see it, right? If even the guy whose books are flying off the shelf because they're being bought by the social justice warriors, if even he could see the danger of the social justice warrior hard left, then, be aware of the difference between these people you're asking me about and most people who are kind of softly, or as I say, by default liberal. Yeah, there are so many things that those of us who are against authoritarianism, whether it's a conservative or a liberal in quotes, flavor, we can just calmly say back to them the principles that they claim to motivate them and link them to the behaviors that we are seeing from the authoritarian left. And it may not change their minds, but it will help change the minds of the softer left who are, who they're alienating, frankly.
One of the things you talk about in your new book, If You Can Keep It, which I believe came out in 2016, you talk about the issue of foreign policy and perception. And I think it's kind of the same thing with what we're talking about now, with how people perceive themselves. So you have all these individuals who, most of whom identify with the left, going out and buying 1984, like you just discussed. In your book, you talk about how Americans tend to not really have any grasp of how they're perceived by the rest of the world. And so your website that you mentioned earlier, Watching America, what you do is you take foreign language news about the United States from the foreign press and translate it into English, which is really a great service, I think, that could and should be informing the American media, although tragically I don't think they're paying too much attention to that, but they should be. But the point is, you're talking about how there's a massive disconnect between the way people perceive themselves, or in this case, how Americans perceive themselves, and how they're perceived by everybody else. And I think it's sort of the same thing with what we're talking about here. Do you see overlap there, and how would that tie in?
Let me see if I understand your question. I mean, the reason I talk about that is, if you want to do good, you have to know the impact of what you're doing, whatever the intention is, right? I mean, in a marriage, this is obvious, right? If you have a relationship with someone that you care about, how they're reacting to you, whatever their reasons for reacting the way they're reacting, even if they're not good, has a material impact on the effect of whatever you're doing. And if you want to get to a certain end, you need to take it into account. It's no good just kind of pretending to rise above it because you're more right than the next guy. Now, the link, if this is what you're asking me, yes, there is a link here, because that's always true. It's true if you're trying to persuade somebody of a political point of view, and it's also true in foreign policy, right? Because I might be doing some action for a particular result, but because I don't know the context properly in which my action is being perceived and responded to. So if I'm dropping bombs in Iraq and I don't know anything about Iraq, then I can't predict the outcomes. So I have to be essentially empirical. I have to look at what my actions are causing, and then I have to test the actual results with an open mind against my stated intent. And, and we have to do that in political persuasion just as in foreign policy. And indeed, one might say that foreign policy is itself a form of political persuasion, I guess, right?
In the most extreme sense, yes.
Yeah.
So along those lines, when we're thinking about how we can find common ground with both people on the left and the right, who are not libertarian in different ways and for different reasons, what do we need to know about their psychology? About because I mean, one of the things that I've learned, and I'm certainly no psychology expert, but people tend to make emotional decisions and then try to find intellectual justification for those decisions, right? And so, I mean, that's the same thing in sales. It's the same thing in marketing and persuasion and anything of the sort. So what is the psychology behind the left, and what is the psychology behind the right, and how can libertarians utilize that knowledge to reach these individuals on the kind of emotional wavelength that they would understand?
Right. Okay. So, and I mean, that's, I've written a book about that kind of, and I give a whole day training to candidates and activists answering really exactly this question. So I can only kind of touch on it here just for lack of time, but it's obviously the most important question. So the first thing to say is really to emphasize something that you just said. And I would put it this way: judgment and justification are different processes. The reasons we form our judgments are not the reasons we give after we formed them for having them, right? Now, we all sincerely believe that the reasons we give for our positions are why we have the positions, but we know that's not true. We form judgments for a myriad of reasons, and many of those reasons are subconscious. We don't even know they are motivating us in moving towards a certain judgment or political opinion. Now, one that we do know, it's kind of ubiquitous among all human beings, even the most kind of rational human beings. And libertarians, by the way, are kind of high on the rational analysis scale when it comes to opinion forming, but they're not immune to this by any means. Something we all do in forming our political opinions is we subconsciously are trying to maintain moral standing among those who we identify as our constituents. And I don't mean constituents in kind of a strictly political sense, but our kind of moral constituents, our immediate community, so our friends and our family. So be aware, if you're trying to persuade someone, if you're conservative and you're trying to persuade a liberal, that if that liberal agrees with you, especially if it's a kind of an argumentative interaction, then what's really at stake, potentially, is this person's relationships with all of their liberal friends. Right? It's the face that they potentially lose when all of the conversations that they've ever had arguing against what you're now convincing them of gets thrown back at them. Yeah. So we have our prevailing political paradigm, our prevailing judgments are very sticky. Now, of course, liberals and conservatives and libertarians and other folks, we have different paradigms. So with that in mind about everybody, we could say about liberals specifically that and I'm crassly approximating, but that a lot of progressive politics is really the politics of good intention, right? So if you want to persuade somebody on the left, then what you will do is reflect back and affirm the intention that drives their politics. Right? Now, you may think that the good intention, let's say, to reduce poverty, should lead them in a libertarian direction. And whereas it's leading them in, say, a welfarist statist direction. But don't go to the disagreement. Go to the agreement. Especially to the fundamental agreement, which in this case would be the agreement about good intention, where we're trying to get to, right? So you spend a lot more time establishing trust on, I also want fewer poor people. Right? I also want more justice. If you're feeling really brave, you could even be all about social justice, because you could find common ground on social justice without conceding a particular meaning of that. Right? But just by even going there, you're showing respect for the paradigm. You're basically telling this person that if I invite this guy that I'm speaking to into my intellectual space, I haven't got anything to fear. Right? He's not threatening my identity, really, he's not threatening my political identity. So whoever you're talking to, you want to spend a lot more time finding the common ground than focusing on the disagreement. And a rule of thumb is, that you've spent enough time establishing trust on the common ground when the person you're talking to is actually asking you for your opinion. If you give an opinion before it's asked, 99 times out of 100, you're not actually going to change somebody's mind. Now, generally, where is the common ground? Well, if it's not obvious, if you don't know somebody very well, use the old salesman's adage, which is, if you shut up for long enough, your customer will tell you how to sell them. People give of themselves in communication. So if you're into persuading, as much of it is about listening persuasively, if that makes sense, rather than even talking persuasively. So there are many pieces to it, but a lot of it is getting out of your own way, getting your ego disinvested from what you believe so that you can hear what this person is telling you about what concerns them, especially if what they're about to tell you is an injustice. People perceive different injustices, but everybody in all contexts, in all cultures, is moved politically by an injustice. So listen for the injustice that moves the person you're speaking to, and then apply your philosophy to that.
I love this advice. The question that keeps coming in my mind is, okay, what What advice do you have for those who have a very hard time hurdling over all the obstacles to, trigger words like social justice? In a conversation with someone who is all about social justice, it's very hard sometimes to sort of get into that frame of mind without even ignoring the fact that you don't have to adopt their definition of it. Or to be more specific, a lot of people on the left have sort of a feeling that, well, no one should go without health care. And we should have we meaning whatever country or society you live in, we should have some way of covering everybody in some way. And I realize that, most people most people on the left think it's single payer. What happens if, as a libertarian, there's no sense in which many libertarians feel this way? They don't believe that there's any obligation for whoever we are, to make sure that everyone has adequate health care. So identifying with somebody who you kind of disagree with on that level has to be hurdled over. What kind of advice do you have for that?
You've got to make your psychological world or universe bigger than your own psychological experience. So now this is something that Jonathan Haidt is brilliant. Go and read The Righteous Mind on this, because it will really help. Haidt identifies 6 moral dimensions. Now, what he means by this is, if you go to any culture in the world that exists in any kind of political spectrum, moral statements can always be understood in terms of 6 spectra. So, for example, moral statements concern justice versus injustice. They concern caring for someone versus harming them. They concern freedom versus suppression, and loyalty versus disloyalty, and so on. Right. So there's 4. I've just listed 4 of them. Now, libertarians live in a much more monodimensional moral universe. If they think that anything is necessarily good if it promotes freedom, and is necessarily bad if it limits it. But they are have just one moral psychological profile, right? There are other people that would say, well, okay, sure, liberty versus suppression or domination is one moral dimension. But if an outcome of your liberty is that harm gets done to people, then your moral universe is incomplete. Now, a libertarian could just deny that axiomatically, but he needs to know that he's just denying it axiomatically. And the reason he feels comfortable doing that is because his moral psychology is different maybe from the progressive. Progressivism basically exists, is actually also quite unidimensional, monodimensional morally. It exists on the care versus harm spectrum.
I think in the book, Haidt even says that there's an advantage politically for those who have more foundations, I think he calls them taste receptors in sort of an analogy, that the politicians who can speak all of those different languages, if you think of them as, different sort of foundational languages of care and harm and liberty versus tyranny, and the other ones that I'm drawing a blank on right now, when you have a politician who can speak all of those languages to all of his or her constituents, they're going to have the advantage. So it sounds like what you're saying is the same is true when we have an argument or a debate or discussion or what we might perceive as those things with somebody. We're not going to have an advantage if we can't begin to sort of speak all those different languages.
Right. That's exactly right. This is this whole point about intellectual humility and making the decision as to what is it you're trying to achieve. Because within your paradigm, you're going to win every argument, right? But that's not the game. So this throwing the net wide is important. You've got to learn. You've got to learn the other. If what you want is to increase liberty in this country, if that's what you really want, rather than to have an ego trip.
So considering our audience here at Libertarian Christian Podcast and whoever may be listening in, as you're out in your churches, in your communities, and you're talking to other Christians who are not libertarian, I think a way to apply what Robin is talking about is you have to consider these people aren't your enemies. These are your brothers and sisters, and they, for whatever reason, are seeing things differently than you. So maybe ways that common ground can be drawn is Do you both care about the kingdom of God? Do you care about honoring Jesus? Do you care about loving the world? Do you care about helping the poor? Do you care about peace and prosperity for families and churches and communities and building civilization? I think in almost every case, you're going to find the answer is yes, you both care about these things, but you have a difference on how you're approaching the issue. And in many cases, like even theologically, seems to be one of the biggest areas we run into as libertarian Christians is people have a different way of interpreting the Bible or interpreting theology than we may. And that can't be won by beating somebody over the head. It has to be won by finding out why they think a certain way and then drawing that connection. And I think the reason that many Christians are not libertarian, it's a mix of theology and the reason that non-Christians are not libertarians, which is just political philosophy and emotion and everything else. So I think it's kind of it's a mix of those two things that sort of combine in a perfect storm that erroneously lead many Christians into some form of statist thinking, whether it be progressive or neoconservative or what have you. Now, Robin, one of your close associates is Jeffrey Tucker, and Jeffrey is Roman Catholic, and he is a great Christian libertarian. He's one of my favorite people in the movement. Tell us a little bit about your work with him and how you think that liberty can promote the flourishing of the human condition and the growth of civilization, all these kind of things that a Christian audience might put a lot of value on.
I'm going to use this question, and you're bringing up Jeffrey as an excuse to talk about something that a lot of interviewers have asked me about that's kind of an important bit of my thinking, and indeed my book, which is, and it should be particularly important to Christians, and I'm thinking now of 1 Corinthians 13:13. The greatest of these is love. I ask the question, what would a politics of love be? And what would that even mean? And for me, it was a big aha moment to realize that liberty is love politicized in this respect, that love wants for its object what it wants for itself. And liberty is about setting up a society and a system that more than accommodates that, but certainly reflects that expresses that, there is that. And Jeffrey Tucker and I came together, I think, on that ground. And I also love Jeffrey because he has written about libertarianism needing to be humane rather than brutalist. And I wrote something similarly, but I kind of used different vocabulary, where I was warning against a libertarian orthodoxy or purism, i.e. making a religion out of the politics. And one of the ways I encapsulate this, as well as saying, liberty is the politics of love, is the only legitimate ends of politics is people. And with that in mind, it is always possible. Sometimes it's easier than at other times, but it's always possible to reformulate a political conflict as a shared problem that we are approaching together. We're walking together towards a solution rather than facing each other off in an argument. And that's about, turning the zero-sum game into really a positive sum exploration. So Jeffrey and I put out a book called Beauty and Truth, Frank and Friendly Conversations on Being Human. That really is just a transcript of 8 or 9 conversations that we have had together, inspired by this idea. And maybe inspired by isn't even the right word. I would maybe put it this way. When we came together originally as two kind of broadly libertarians, and we started to really explore why we believed what we believed, we found ourselves going to love. Because when you really get to it, that's the root. That is the root. And it makes sense, right? Because love is truth. For your Christian audience, God is love. How could it be anything else? How could it be anything other than, to the extent that liberty is the correct or the right or the best political philosophy, it must be reflective of love. I know Jeffrey gets that very deeply, and I know we have come together over that sentiment and that understanding.
I think it's exciting that you have teamed up with Jeffrey Tucker on such an important endeavor. When you were in one of the conversations with Jeffrey I was listening to this week, one of the questions you asked was, how can we promote liberty for the purpose of human flourishing? And that phrase, human flourishing, is, I want to say it in a way, it's an all-encompassing term. It's very loaded in one sense, but it also has a lot of meaning in another. Yeah,
this is really important, because there are some folks that Jeffrey would call the brutalist libertarians, that kind of, they have their philosophy right. He calls it a kind of false constructivism, right? They have this idea of a principle, so the non-aggression principle, and that's kind of is supposed to answer every question. And so they pay no attention to the actual institutions, the actual kind of historical accidents that we live with, the practicalities of life, the things that are beautiful in life, and the way that we as human beings respond to them. And I think that is a reason why a lot of libertarians have failed to be compelling, because in just kind of banging on about like this kind of constructed philosophy, they fail to reflect back to people their own experience of life. They fail to reflect back to people what moves those people, what excites those people.
Right. And nobody's going to listen to a curmudgeon who complains about the government coming to take his guns all the time.
Right. And indeed, or even to somebody who doesn't complain, but just does kind of rational philosophy and says everybody should obviously agree because, here's the axiom and here's your political philosophy that falls right out of it, because it just doesn't engage the human experience. And I would say more broadly, and this goes to a question you asked me earlier, if you want to know how to persuade people, you don't get them to understand you. You get them to see that you understand them. Trump won and Nigel Farage and Brexit won, right, as all political insurgents do, by showing people, reflecting people back to themselves, right? Now, here's a huge political takeaway. When the political mainstream does not reflect a concern back to a population, and then somebody comes along who does, not telling them what they should believe, not telling them what's right, but just saying essentially, you have this concern and I get it and I have it too. And the folks who hear you say that actually believe that you feel the same about it. You're not just saying it, but you feel the same about it. Then they will start to agree with you. If you say a problem back to them, if you say a problem, you identify a problem and you speak it to them and they go, yeah, that's what I've been feeling and nobody else is saying that, they're going to pretty much believe what you say next as the solution, without actually doing a rational analysis of whatever the solution is. Now, you could say, well, that's a bit dangerous or a bit scary, but it's human nature. So Trump wins like that. Nigel Farage and Brexit wins like that. And we have to win like that, and there's nothing dishonest about it, because we're not going to lie that we're doing it. We're going to recognize that if we care enough about these principles, that we're even in the space having political arguments, that we're even talking about liberty, that we're even talking about love, that the only purpose of doing that is to try and make things better. And we have a choice as to whether to be effective communicators or less effective ones. And we choose to be more effective, which means that we engage people with their on an emotional level as well as a rational level. We understand and we try and learn about the process of judgment formation, even in as much as it is nothing to do with the process of justifying the judgments after we formed them. Right? Let's get good at it. That's a choice.
As we begin to wrap up, I think some questions that maybe some of our listeners may have is, what are some good, or maybe some examples of some really bad cliches or arguments or tacks to take with respect to trying to convert people? A couple that come to mind are things like, taxation is theft. There's that hashtag, and there's some other examples. Do you have some personal favorites that if you have to, only a few moments to help someone just rethink and retweak? What kind of advice do you have? What cliches should we completely avoid? And I don't want to call them cliches because they may actually be effective.
Actually, the taxation is theft is a really good one. And I actually am the communications director for an organization called Tax Revolution Institute that is actually advocating making the quote voluntary unquote tax system actually voluntary. It's a campaign that I was massively involved in creating. And I will never say taxation is theft. It's
Make voluntary voluntary again?
Yeah, our tagline, if you go to taxrevolution.us, the line is making, quote, voluntary, unquote, taxation voluntary. And the punchline is, what if the government had to earn your money? Now, actually, that's a really good thing to do as well. Practice this. Formulate every political assertion as a question. Like, that's actually, if you want to get good at persuasion, turn every statement you want to make into a question.
And that's very Socratic, isn't it? It's Socratic questioning. You learn to turn things into questions, and nobody can accuse you of making a statement they disagree with because you just asked them a question.
Right, and we understand more now than it was understood in Socrates' days why that's so effective. It turns out that the mind treats differently things that it believes is one's own from those that it believes belongs to somebody else. And that works with possessions, it works with land, and it works even with ideas. So if you can get someone to an idea such that the last step is one where it's their idea, then you're going to be a lot more effective. So avoid the taxation is theft. Avoiding the idea that there simply is one theory out of which every political answer drops. That's a kind of a meta thing that libertarians get wrong all the time. Avoid that, but avoid the vocabulary that triggers the people that you're talking to. If I'm talking to a conservative, I'm not going to say I'm for social justice, and if I am talking to a progressive, I will talk, let's say I'll use terms like the Constitution differently from if I'm talking to a conservative, right? Because all of these words have triggers. They are triggers, and what they trigger changes with time, and it changes among political communities. Be sensitive to that. So, and also you can flip it on its head. If you're talking to a progressive, you may not mean by welfare what he means, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't use the word. You should use the word, because then you can be on the same side of a discussion talking about what actually welfare really is, what actually is for the human good. Right? Use the word. It gets you on side. It shows kind of respect for their vocabulary, their views. Whereas a lot of conservatives just won't do it. Oh, I'm not going to use that word. Oh, welfare. Precisely because they're being triggered by it, because they're on the other side. There are so many techniques, and this is why I give these kind of day-long seminars, because there are so many. And you know what? Just generally, most fundamentally, never impugn somebody's intent, integrity, or intelligence, unless you're absolutely 110% sure. You've got to typically know a lot more about someone than you usually know when you're having a political argument with them, to be able to call into question their intelligence or their morality. Nobody has ever been sold anything by a salesman who they know disrespects them morally or in terms of their intelligence. So don't do it. Just stop. Everybody stop. And sometimes we don't do it explicitly, but we do it in the way we talk, especially libertarians again, right? Because we're all the rational ones. And there you are just being emotional. And we kind of condescend to that. Well, don't, stop condescending. Stop intellectually.
How do you advise people to stop doing that? I mean, I work with people who are constantly maligning Donald Trump, or way back when they were constantly maligning George W. Bush, and so they're on the left. So how do we, other than you're speaking to libertarians here in this audience generally, and you're kind of like, hey guys, let's cut it out. But if you're in a debate with somebody who just is maligning this third character that you're talking about, mostly politicians that they don't like, how do we address that and kind of call them out on it in a friendly way?
This comes back to, you've got to listen. Are they at least trying to engage the issue, or are they basically doing massive identity politics, right? So, okay, this is Trump, or this guy likes Trump, therefore, and he's a bogeyman, he's bad, therefore he's a fascist, therefore he's if what's going on is some political entity, like Trump, is basically just a hook for people to hang their anger on, then what's really being worked out here is different from maybe in a more a calmer, results-orientated political debate. So listen for that. As I say, don't waste time on people that are kind of raging. If the gap is too far, just go to the next person. We don't need to win them all. We only basically need 10%. Those folks, let them rage. Like, let them get it out often is helpful. And then just listen for those little bits that you can agree with and agree with them. I mean, if you're going to spend the time, you've got to at least do that. You've got to at least make it clear that you're not a partisan for whatever they're a partisan against. Because most of, as I say, politics is identity politics. So what you can't do is immediately put yourself in the conflicting identity box, right? So, I mean, that takes a lot of work, but the same principles, the same principles apply. And also, when you find that common ground, actually say something honest about why it's true to you. Like, say something personal about how you connect to whatever that one thing in the 100 that they said is also right for you, so that they can hear the authenticity, they can see the personal connection with it. And why would you do it? What's going to make you good at it? Well, a couple of things. If you actually listen to people for that in that way, you're going to learn something. You're going to improve your philosophy. You're going to get the information that you need to be more effective at changing people's minds for liberty. Well, first of all, you want to be more effective because that's the only way we're going to get more liberty. And secondly, it's actually a lot more fun. It's a lot more fun to get good at it. It's a lot more fun to shut up, to listen, to understand what it is you have to reflect back to someone of themselves that is also true to you. And then it turns out that you start to persuade people that you never thought you could persuade, because before you couldn't. There's a number of things to do here. There's lots of great books out there, and there's a lot more to be said about this. But those are good places to start.
If our listeners are interested in picking up a copy of If You Can Keep It, your book, which I highly recommend, where should they go to do that?
Hey, thank you for asking. Go to ifyoucankeepit.us. Ifyoucankeepit.us. Because if you pick up a copy there, I will personally send you a signed copy. If, however, for some reason you would rather have your copy not signed and you go to Amazon, be sure that you get the right book. Because my book is called If You Can Keep It, Why We Nearly Lost It and How We Get It Back. And at the time this was published, I think like a month earlier or a month later, another book of the same title but a different subtitle came out. So the one you want is If You Can Keep It, Why We Nearly Lost It and How We Get It Back by Robin Koerner. But as I say, the easiest thing to do is just go to ifyoucankeepit.us and I will send you a signed copy.
Fantastic. Thank you, Robin. And we will directly link both to your website and to the correct purchase point on Amazon as well. Another thing that was just kind of coming to my mind is one of the things that Robin talks about in the end of his book, and he made some reference to it here earlier, is thinking of liberty as the politics of love. So as a Christian libertarian, as you're talking to other Christians about liberty, that's just a great way to phrase something is this a loving action? I mean, oftentimes, especially as Christians, we sometimes are kind of wary when people talk about love because they put a wrong spin on it, as if it just means, hey, do whatever you want, that's cool. There's no ethical standards in the world. Just, as long as you're doing your thing, you're fine. But as Christians, we understand that love is, like Robin said, seeking what's best for the person. So if you really want what's best for the person, if you want them to flourish, and as a Christian specifically, if you want them to know the joy and peace of the Lord, the answer probably isn't bombing them, regulating them to death, invading their country, and all these other, or stealing from them in order to finance the welfare state, whatever it may be. The answers are voluntary. These are the things that actually encourage people to cooperate, to work together, to build society. And so framing it around that, how these aggressive state actions that are supported by the voters are often not loving. They're violent, they're coercive, they're destructive. They're not what the individual would want done to them if the roles were reversed. And I think phrasing it in that way it's just a great way to reach people for liberty generally, and it definitely applies to Christian libertarians thinking, how can I reach other Christians with the message of liberty? Frame it around what is love, and Jesus is love. He's love incarnate, and if it doesn't look like Jesus, it's probably not a loving action. So that's all the time we have here today on the Libertarian Christian Podcast. Robin, it was fantastic to have you. I learned a ton, and I'm sure many of our listeners did as well. If you'd like to reach out to us and ask a question or submit some feedback, listeners, you can reach us at podcast@libertarianchristians.com, as well as on Facebook, Twitter, and our main website, libertarianchristians.com. You can also donate to support the Libertarian Christian Podcast as we continue to bring you future episodes at libertarianchristians.com/donate. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time.
The Libertarian Christian Podcast is a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute, a registered 501c3 nonprofit. The audio engineers were Doug Stewart and Jason Rink, and voiceovers were by Matthew Bellis and Caitlin Horn. If you'd like to find out more about the LCI, please visit us on the web at www.libertarianchristians.com.
If you found this video interesting, then please go ahead and like it, subscribe to my channel, Robin Koerner, The Art of Political Persuasion, and maybe check out some of my other content like this video right here.